Welcome to Bitcoin Fixes This, where we explore the impact that Bitcoin will have in all aspects of society. Today's guest is Cynthia Lummis, Senator-elect from Wyoming, former member of Congress, former state treasurer, and former state legislator. We talk about politics, how money influences everything, and the incentives of government. Cynthia also tells us about her hope for Congress, the people who are having trouble ends meet, and what Bitcoin represents. It's hard to put into words what talking to Senator Lummis is like in person. She's such a sweet, caring person, and it's hard not to walk away encouraged after interacting with her. She clearly has a heart that wants to see everyone succeed and understands the importance of Bitcoin going forward. I hope this interview can help you understand who she is and how she will be in her role as a senator. Cynthia Lummis, thank you, Senator, for being here. How's everything going?
You know, it's my pleasure to be here with you, Jimmy, and things are going great. We got through our November 3rd election, and I went to freshman orientation. I call it senator school. So I was in Washington for a few days getting a temporary office. It is on the ground floor of the Dirksen building. There are 3 Senate office buildings. The Dirksen is the one in the middle. And found out what the swearing in is going to be like, and went through things like sexual harassment training and employee law provisions, and met with the physician of the Capitol, the chaplain of the Capitol, as well as the Republican senators. In my case, I didn't spend much time with Democrat Senate leadership, but I did spend the 2 days with all 7 newly elected senators, 3 of whom are Democrats and 4 are Republicans.
Okay. All right. Wow. So there's a whole senator orientation kind of thing that's going
correct.
on? Okay.
Yes.
And what's that like?
Well, we all got temporary offices. We met originally in the Capitol building in one of the meeting rooms. So we got to meet each other and then get some briefings from the Secretary of the Senate. We also spent some time not only walking around in the Senate chambers and understanding what the protocols are for being in the cloak rooms, which are these little ante rooms in the Senate, but what the protocol is on the floor of the Senate. We don't know yet what desks in the Senate will be ours, because everything happens based on seniority in the Senate. So if a senator wants a different desk because they have a particular admiration for a long-time member of the Senate whose desk was theirs, and they can move to a different desk. It's all based on seniority, and it's very tradition-oriented. Now, I served 8 years in the House of Representatives, and it wasn't nearly that oriented towards seniority, and the traditions were less fixed and less revered. But it seems that the Senate has a more reverential approach to those who went before. So in that respect, the historic nature of the Senate is very different from the House and is very much more appreciated and respected.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of House of Lords and House of Commons or something like that. Just sort of one is a little bit more, because you have a longer term and things like that, maybe as they have more time to establish, traditions and things like that.
Exactly. Well, when I was in the House, we used to say the House plays rugby and the Senate plays golf. So that sort of, to me, says a lot about the rhythms of the House versus the Senate.
Hey, I didn't realize there was a cultural change from going from the House to the Senate, and that sounds like something that you're in the middle of.
It is something I'm in the middle of, and it's going to be an adjustment. So among the things I've started doing as a direct result of developing an appreciation for those historic precedents is to do some more studying. So I'm starting with the seat that I am assuming and going clear back to the first senator who held the specific seat that I am assuming, and I'm trying to learn more about each of those gentlemen, and then I'll branch out from there.
Right, so it's some multiple of 6 years from now before, and you go every 6 years and look at each one.
Exactly.
How many people were before you in Wyoming?
Well, I'm not exactly sure yet because I'm in the middle of that research, but probably about 12.
Okay, wow, that's a lot. I assume they had at least 6 years, 6-year terms, so some of them probably had like 12 or 18, something like that.
Yes.
So that's crazy. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about money and politics because this is something that comes up all the time. Can you summarize for us how money plays in politics, like specifically in getting elected, all of the stuff that comes with that? Because I think you've held positions at various levels. I think you were in the state legislature for a while, and then you're obviously in the House, and you're now in the Senate. I imagine those have some different economics, but what are they?
Well, the first time I ran for the Wyoming legislature, the State House, was in 1978. I think my campaign cost me $300.
Wow.
And my most recent campaign, which was wrapped up just a couple weeks ago, was over $2 million. But Jimmy, mine was probably the cheapest campaign in the country for a Senate race. Others are running into the $100+ million for a Senate race, even in my neighboring state of Montana, which only has about 1.3 million people. So the cost of that Senate race was astronomical compared to mine.
100 million in Montana. Like, I can't imagine like how many commercials that buys you and like what kind of signage you get. Like, how do they even spend $100 million in Montana?
Well, exactly. And the same thing happened in South Carolina. The Democratic candidate against the sitting incumbent in South Carolina, and that's Lindsey Graham, had more money than he could even spend because you hit a point of saturation with regard to media advertising of all kinds, whether it's television, radio, online, and he literally had more money than he could spend. That's the first time I've ever heard of that happening, but that's the kind of money that was invested in this election.
Wow, that's so insane that they hit a point of saturation. There's very rarely any sort of place where you have a budget and you say, I want to spend this money, and you can't find a place to spend it.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I think that that's an illustration of how different this election was than past elections. I can never remember that being the case before in an earlier election. So this year will be analyzed for how dramatically different it was from past elections in terms of the amount of money spent and how it was raised. And the Democrats have a huge head start on Republicans in terms of their ability to raise money through small dollars online. They have something called Act Blue that is an online fundraising mechanism that sends money directly to candidates. Money sent directly to candidates is more efficient because candidates can get the lowest rate for buying a TV ad, whereas if an outside group, a third-party group, comes in and buys an ad, they're competing for the higher rates. But candidates have to, by law, be quoted the lowest rate available. Well, the Act Blue, which is the Democrats' direct fundraising effort, realized that, got money directly to candidates so they could maximize the outreach they had, the saturation they had through those small dollar donations, and it's been very effective. The Republicans are beginning to catch up, but it's going to take a while.
What changed in this past election that made, I guess, the cost of an election astronomical?
Well, part of it is Act Blue, and a lot of outside money going into campaigns in states where one party or another thought they could pick up a seat. Certainly that was true in Mark Kelly's win in Arizona. He beat the incumbent, Martha McSally, and a lot of that money came in from California. And part of it is because Californians know that their senators are always going to be Democrats, at least based on current political demographics. So they want to take their money and have an impact in other states and other races. And so they made a huge impact in Arizona. I think they were pretty active in Colorado, which was another state that flipped from Republican to Democrat. Cory Gardner was defeated by John Hickenlooper. And so this is an area where Democrats who have a sure bet of keeping California in Democrat hands can go out and play in other states. Conversely, in my state, which is very Republican, you might have some Republicans that can go out and assume that a Republican's going to win in Wyoming, so they can go out and try to impact other races. The difference is California has, 52 million people or something?
Yeah, it's a
insane.
very large place.
Yeah, compared to only about 600,000 in Wyoming. So you just have a concentration of money in California that is unique to California, so they can really get involved in other races.
And what do they spend all of this money on? I imagine a lot of it is ads of some kind or another, but I mean, there have got to be other costs involved.
Absolutely, there are. So there are field staff. There are databases that you buy so you can understand
where to campaign?
Where to campaign. So it's so sophisticated now, Jimmy, that I can go to a door and I know that this person has not yet voted, is undecided, and leans either right of center or left of center. And I was asking, how can you possibly know that?
Yeah, I mean, that's as a privacy advocate.
I know
it scares me.
It bothers me too. But they said, well, we know that they subscribe to the Rifleman, which is the NRA magazine, so that means they lean right. Or they subscribe to some other magazine that normally is subscribed to by someone who leans left. So the choices that you make online, the magazines to which you subscribe, maybe the services, they know demographically, are you watching MSNBC? Well, you must lean left, or you're watching Fox News, so you must lean right. And all of that is distilled down to the house-by-house level. And so they know to maximize your time spent, if you're going to be literally knocking on doors, advocating for a candidate, which doors to knock on and which doors not to.
Wow. So it looks like they've been driven by data analytics of some kind.
Oh, so much so. And you know more about that, Jimmy, than I do. But they're taking the same data analytics that would cause, if I go on Wayfair, and Wayfair knows that I'm looking at a love seat, all of a sudden I'll start getting these things that pop up and say, oh, look at this love seat, look at that love seat. Wayfair knows that I'm looking for a love seat. I'm not looking for a wine cooler. Well, the same is true politically.
Wow.
And so I think it does show that the area of expertise that you hold and that a lot of your listeners hold is being applied now in the political realm.
That's kind of scary because, I mean, at least for me, I like making sure that I have as little of a footprint, although, you know, I mean, I have a Twitter account and things like that. But as far as like my shopping habits and stuff, it's a little creepy that, you know, all that stuff is known about me. And like, you know, people that are candidates get to use that? Is this filtering down to even like local elections?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
It is creepy. It's very creepy, but it is the way of campaigning in the year 2020. And the more information about ourselves that we make available through our choices online or our shopping habits that are gathered in databases, the more apt that information is to be applied in political campaigns as well.
Wow. So I can't imagine like being an undecided voter. You must because everyone has the same data, you must get absolutely bombarded by advertisements from both sides.
Absolutely bombarded. You are so right. So the the safe bet is whether you've decided or not, just say, I'm for X or I'm for Y, just so you won't be bothered.
Oh, wow. That's crazy. And so there's all this money coming in. Obviously, the people that are contributing this money want something back. What's their end game? What is it? Just so that they get some law passed, or is there more than that?
Well, I really do believe, and maybe this is the Pollyanna in me, I still really believe that people who contribute to political campaigns do so mainly because they have a certain ideology. They view themselves as either more Republican or Libertarian, so they're more oriented towards personal freedom and personal privacy, but a more transparent and smaller government. Or they lean towards a more Democrat philosophy, which seems to me to be less personal privacy, but more government privacy, larger federal governments, and a comfort level with more government encroachment in their personal lives. So less personal freedom in exchange for a more level playing field regardless of your personal ambition or work ethic. So it seems to me that people who tend to think like I do, which is more individual freedom, more entrepreneurial, it would tend to support Republican candidates. So that is my Pollyanna view of the world, that it truly is based on core values and a philosophy. Whereas, there are some people, I'm sure, who are trying to buy either access to candidates so they can influence their decision-making about certain issues, or even more specifically, they have identified someone who supports a very specific certain position that they can benefit from, and then supporting that specific person because of one very specific position.
Yeah, I can see that definitely for industry lobbying or something like that. And what role do, I guess, lobbyists and these lobbies play in politics with respect to government budgets and things like that?
Well, what I have found is there are certain committees that attract very little attention from lobbyists. There are things like the Judiciary Committee, which is picking judges. There are things like the Government Oversight Committee, because they're not making laws. They are just overseeing that the executive branch is implementing the laws as they were designed. So those are committees where you don't have a lot of lobbyist attention. Where you have a lot of lobbyist attention is like the Commerce Committee, the Banking Committee, the Finance Committee. Those are all committees that are affecting public policy that can directly affect your pocketbook or your ability to trade, or it could affect an industry like the transportation industry or the energy industry, where the federal government is picking winners and losers in energy. And some people want to weigh in on that outcome, and they want to know they have access to people who are going to be making those decisions. That's where lobbying money comes in.
And how does that affect the budget at every level? I'm sure you're very familiar with the state level and the federal level, at least. I imagine that has to affect budgeting in some way.
It affects it at the federal level far more than at the state level, in my experience. In the state level, the way that budgets are made is in large part finding out how much money you have to spend and allocating it among the typical state obligations, K through 12 education, corrections, health care, and
infrastructure maybe.
Yeah,
Okay.
and infrastructure, general operations of government, certainly highways and airports. At the federal level, I think lobbying dramatically affects budgets and is part of the reason, because the federal government can print money. And so there's really no limits on spending. And because of that, there's a lot of lobbying with regard to how money is spent. At the state level, you're more constrained because states can't print money. And so they have to either live within their budgets or within their ability to borrow money. Whereas, so they have constraints. There are sideboards on states. There's no sideboards on the federal government.
So would you say that there's less lobbying at the state level because of the budget constraints that you have?
There's certainly less lobbying that affects the budget. There is lobbying that affects policy, but in Washington, it's both. It's policies that affect the private sector and individuals, but it's also policies that affect expenditures.
So you're talking about the federal government and how they really have no limit. You know, I mean, at the very least, nominally, we're supposed to have the debt ceiling, right? Like that's supposed to be a limitation on the budgets that or the deficits that federal government is allowed to run. How does that square? What's the actual process by which that gets subverted or whatever?
It's called suspend. You suspend the debt ceiling. And I, like you, Jimmy, when I got there, thought the thing to do is to don't raise the debt ceiling without getting in return some spending cuts. So I thought this is the magic potion to reining in spending. And I was totally wrong, because if you can get enough people to suspend the debt ceiling, hold it completely in abeyance while you spend and spend and spend, then it does not act as a curb. And certainly that's been the case during COVID. And I get it. I get why the Cures Act was important. We had individuals who had no means of feeding their families. We had employers who desperately wanted to keep their businesses open and employ the people who needed to feed their families, but they were not allowed to. In a case like that where government intervenes, government then needs to provide some financial valve or outlet. So I totally get that. Our problem as a society was that we were spending more than we were taking in for years before COVID hit. And so there was no runway left and we just had to keep spending way beyond our headlights, way beyond. And so now here we find ourselves, nearing 27 trillion in debt. When I entered Congress, Jimmy, in 2009, the end of 2008, I think we were below 10 trillion.
Yeah.
We were 9-point-something trillion. Now that has tripled in a very short time, short time. And so it's one of the reasons I'm kind of interested in Bitcoin, because I see as we print more money, and the U.S. dollar has inflation built into it already. 2% inflation every year is their target. But when we're printing money like we've had to during the last year or two, I think we're debasing our currency.
Yeah.
And so I think I want to take a two-pronged approach going to the Senate. One is to try to rationalize our spending. So for people who stay with the U.S. dollar as their main fiat currency, that we're trying to preserve as much of its value as we can. But in light of the fact that neither party, Republicans or Democrats, have shown any restraint with regard to spending, I think we need to have another track And that is a track that stores value, that retains value, that has a limited supply and thereby scarcity, preserving its value and hopefully increasing its value, but never debasing its value. So that's one of the reasons I'm attracted to Bitcoin.
Yeah, it sounds like, well, what inflation does is it actually like takes away people's savings, right? And
Exactly.
that debasement. And what it sounds like you're interested in is making it easier for people to save so that they can have funds for a rainy day, something that Congress obviously hasn't done in a long time.
Exactly. You know, I walked in this building today. There were men across the street building a building, construction workers, and they're being encouraged to save their money for when their bodies wear out and they can't work anymore. Well, but by the same token, the same government that is encouraging them to save their money is making sure their money is worth less and less and less. And so I think it's kind of cruel to put people in that position. So I'm just delighted that there's an alternative to buying power loss that is associated with the U.S. dollar, and that alternative is Bitcoin.
Yeah, and that's obviously something that my listeners are very familiar with, and you're kind of preaching to the choir here. But I'm curious, I think you have a great message, this idea of helping the American worker essentially like save their money, right? Like, and not have it debased away from them. How do you communicate that to your Senate colleagues? How do you make the case? And what sort of policy would you advocate for in order to make that happen?
Well, I think to start out with, the policy is let's keep our hands as federal policymakers off of this and let it naturally evolve. Let's see how it does before we start tinkering and messing with it. In the case of, and the example that I would use while I'm trying to inform and make other senators aware of Bitcoin and how it works and why its fundamentals are so solid, is case in point my state of Wyoming. Wyoming has passed laws that allow for banks to be chartered that can transact in both Bitcoin and fiat currency. And it's the first state to do so. And it's even set up a chancery court which can allow for the development of case law about the use of Bitcoin in relation to commerce and commercial activities, as well as personal transactions. So we want to be a state that is the incubator of innovation for Bitcoin. And if you look in recent years, the states really have been the innovators when it comes to a level of government that is more nimble and able to help create and shape government policies around things that are happening in the real world. And so in the case of Bitcoin, I'm hopeful that I can not only go to my fellow senators and explain what I know about Bitcoin, which isn't a lot, but at least I have an understanding and appreciation of the fundamentals. And explain to them how it works, why it should be a component of financial diversified asset allocation, and why it is maybe the most stable store of value that is available to anyone who's saving money today. And then also explain what my state is doing and say, let my state and other states that want to try and innovate in this area, let them legislate. Let's watch them and learn from their mistakes and their successes before the federal government gets involved.
Yeah, I guess what you're advocating here is sort of like, different states trying different things. It's almost like entrepreneurship and governance or something like that.
You've got it. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, and through that, maybe come up with policy that's, that works for everybody and gets them to be able to save and so on.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that sounds awesome. I really hope that will come to pass. I guess the question I would have then is, In the meantime, there are certain crypto laws and things like, or at least the way that the IRS is treating Bitcoin and things like that. Like, are there any plans for you to change or to try to influence those federal government organizations, towards maybe treating Bitcoin a little more fairly than it's been?
I want to explore those ideas, but for this first year or two in the Senate, what I've come to realize is more information about Bitcoin needs to become readily available to members of the Senate so they can become more conversant and comfortable with it. Because, as you know, some knee-jerk reactions to Bitcoin is, oh, well, it's used to hide dark money and transactions that are nefarious. And then they stop their thinking right there. And I want to dispel the notion that that is the main purpose of Bitcoin. Just as there are dark money transactions in Bitcoin, there are dark money transactions in fiat currency. And they're not... That's an apples-to-apples comparison. We shouldn't dismiss Bitcoin because that's a possibility. It's a possibility with any investment. Okay. So first we need to get past that. Then we need to be able to explain, here's how it works. Here's why it's stable. Here's why it should be part of investment portfolios. And even more important, here's why it's a better store of value than the U.S. dollar. And I know that scares some people, but we have brought this on ourselves as federal policymakers by debasing the value of the U.S. dollar. So we can either be in denial and say, oh, we're going to get this under control. Well, never in my experience in the federal government have we even approached the notion of getting it under control. Tell me, Jimmy, do you know of a plan to reduce our national debt?
I have not heard a single one since I've been paying attention. Yeah.
Neither have I, Jimmy. And so since there's no policy, there's no committee or group that's been put together to say, how are we going to retire this debt over time? It doesn't exist. And because of that, I think we need to acknowledge our failure, and I consider it a failure. We need to acknowledge our failure and say, okay, since we have not responsibly addressed this issue, we have to find ways to help the American people retire with dignity and make sure that what they are saving is going to have a significant value, at least flat value, or increasing value going forward. But right now, all we're assuring them is a declining value.
Yeah, in a sense, all the extra spending is being taken from their savings. So it's kind of, at least we in the Bitcoin world call inflation sort of like a stealth taxation, right? Like taxation without, which it's very strange. It's taxation without representation because it's done by the Fed,
Yes.
without any legislation because, Congress doesn't really control the Fed. They're supposed to be independent. And, without any transparency whatsoever because we only find out about it, if at all, like months later. So it's so strange to me that this power of taxing has been given to this separate organization that's almost not supposed to be public almost. It still boggles my mind that the central banks work the way they do. And it's, I don't know, a little bit of a tragedy that so few people seem to understand it.
Well, I agree, but it's something we need to start discussing in very open settings. And I think that members of Congress and the House and the Senate are both embarrassed to discuss it in the open because we're the ones who have helped create this mess by deferring it, thinking we can address this later. It's getting to the point where we need to have a plan to stabilize Social Security. We need to have a plan to stabilize Medicare. And in addition, we need to have a plan to reduce our debt. And we have none of those. I was I co-sponsored a bipartisan bill when I was in the U.S. House that would have stabilized Social Security for 70 years. And it went nowhere. And the more we put it off, the more difficult it is to stabilize. The same is true with Medicare. But even with those programs set aside, we're getting to the point where if the interest on our national debt, if the rate increases very much, and it's hard to imagine interest rates more favorable than they are now, but if interest rates increase very much, we could be paying more in interest on the national debt than we pay for national defense. And if you look at the Constitution, national defense is one of the most important obligations of the Congress. So we've backed ourselves into a corner. I think we need to acknowledge that we've backed ourselves into a corner. I support a two-pronged approach to getting out of this. One is to come up with a plan to address these major problems that we've created in our debt. And the other one is to have an alternative policy that I think the bedrock of which is Bitcoin going forward. So in the event that the Congress fails in a mission to reduce the national debt, to stabilize Social Security and Medicare, that we actually have a plan B that is stable, that is secure, that has a foundation, that is based on 21 million Bitcoin, no more than that ever being mined, and something that can sustain its value because we know what the policy is behind it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the things about that absolute scarcity, that sound money that Bitcoin represents, is that this is not something that Congress can very easily dip their hand in the cookie jar to grab some of. Whereas that's very easy with the dollar. It's not necessarily Congress, it's more the Fed, and then they lend money to Congress or to the federal government or whatever. But ultimately, it comes out of our savings, which is, like I said, it's so mind-boggling to me that this is not something that most people seem to really get. It's like, oh, who cares about the debt? Where, it's, the Keynesian quote is, it's debt we owe to ourselves. Well, no, it's one group of people to another, and it's usually the present people to the future people.
Yes, exactly right.
Yeah, and that's scary. What? And it seems like we're now in a position where we kind of have to pay the piper.
I think we do. I think we do have to pay the piper. So one of the things I'm hopeful, again, putting my Pollyanna hat on, is that going forward we can come off our COVID spending hangover. Hopefully after we get a vaccine, people normalize from this weird COVID time, and then start addressing what will be the hangover from this. How do we rebuild our economy? How do we bring jobs back from China? How do we make sure that we have robust employment? And how do we start reducing our debt and our deficit, or explore ways to provide regular working Americans with an option that is not tied to the Fed, the Congress, and to Wall Street. And we finally have one. For a while, there was no alternative. But now there's an alternative out there that we can turn to. So I don't want Congress to mess it up. I hope that we'll have good policies at the IRS to nurture a field that in which Bitcoin can grow. But, Congress, if, as they say, if it moves, tax it. And so if it stops moving, subsidize it. That's just kind of been our history. So I hope we let this one go and recognize the unique qualities that Bitcoin has in terms of providing a bedrock of value for people who are saving for their futures and working really hard to do it. Those guys who are across the street from where we are right now that are building that building, they're working really hard. let's find a way for them to save and have that value preserved. So when they really do retire, when their bodies just wear out from all that hard physical work, that they really can rest from their labors in a secure retirement.
That's a beautiful way of describing what store value really actually means at a very human, practical level. And it's that, you want to be able to save for the future and plan for the future, but you won't be able to if it gets debased away from you or essentially stolen, which is so...
It is. It gets people, young people like you, to say, why should I save? Because my saving is going to be so unrewarded that I don't know that it's worth doing. If I were your age, I'd actually entertain those thoughts. But we have to address this. We've come to the end, I think, of our rope, and it's time to address it. I don't know how we can put this off anymore.
And allowing people to save and have a future and have hope for the future. In a way, like, savings is for many people like their hope, and when you take that away, it's just sort of like reducing their hope, and instead they have to live for now and consume way too much now. And it's crazy to me that because there are no good stores of value, essentially people have been putting their money into stock and real estate, and both things just seem way beyond their utility value, and now they have a store value premium. What do you think will happen as more people adopt Bitcoin? What do you think how do you think your role will change? How do you think the role of politics and society will change and so on?
Well, that's something I hope to explore with people like you in the future. Because, for example, I would like to see my state's permanent funds have some Bitcoin in them to have a solid base and then still be able to invest in the stock market and some of those, what I would say are riskier investments for people who cannot afford to invest in land, which is another finite resource, or who just their lifestyle is not based in land. Bitcoin provides something that I think is going to be as stable as land. So for somebody like me who's a rancher, my whole world revolves around land, what it can produce, the euphoria that I get by being on the land. That's not everybody has that, and especially in a world that is urban than rural, the agrarian person is fewer and farther between. Bitcoin can provide, I think, in some ways, that same bedrock of comfort that you have something of value that nobody can take away from you. And so I think that in some ways, Bitcoin will provide some people security. And so it's something that can't be stolen from me. It's like an education. Nobody can steal your education from you. Nobody can steal your Bitcoin from you. If you have your wallet secure, nobody can take it. And I think that there's some peace of mind to that. And in some ways, where we see on social media, where your opinions are discounted if they're not shared by the owners of the platform. With Bitcoin, there's a complete detachment from that kind of social penalty. So I just think it's going to provide some personal security that what I own is not transparent to the world, but I know about it. And that gives me a sense of calm. So in some ways, I think that it provides sort of an emotional security blanket that some people can't feel because they see how much more everything costs as the money that they have saved doesn't keep up with those costs. But if you have Bitcoin, you've got that bedrock and that store of so in some ways the store of value is an emotional construct, much the way it is an economic construct.
Yeah, it is sort of like an anxiety in fiat money, isn't there? Because you know that it's being sort of slowly drained away. And it's probably kind of like, water you swim in or something that you don't really notice until you get into Bitcoin maybe. And then you go like, wait a second, I don't need to be this anxious.
Yes. Yeah. Well, those are some of the things that I suspect will happen, but it'll be fun for me to stay in touch with you and learn from you because you tend to engage with people who are in the formative years of Bitcoin, and you will learn more quickly than I will what some of the ancillary benefits or consequences are of not being tied to a fiat currency for everything. So I'm anxious to stay in touch with you and people like you because you're the pioneers.
Well, I can certainly tell you that it's changed my thinking on a lot of things, like in surprising ways. Like I know, like before Bitcoin, I used to be a big bargain hunter, right? Like go on the websites and find like, Black Friday's coming up soon. So that would have been like a big day for me where I was like, all right, let's look for all the best bargains on all kinds of stuff, buying stuff I don't need and all that stuff. Nowadays, it's like, okay, I'm not buying it until I absolutely need it, and because the savings technology is available, the store of value is available, I'm like, why would I buy that? Even if it's on sale, if I just wait, it's going to be cheaper in the long run. If I just wait, even if it's not on sale. And that's a very different mentality. And I feel like, and this is something that I mentioned to other people, is that that's the kind of mentality that causes you to save, that causes capital accumulation, and that causes entrepreneurship. Because ultimately what you end up doing, you save this money so that you can have something much better later. And that to me is like the mentality that people need to be in order to grow and make civilization better.
So do you think that it will unleash people who are entrepreneurial minded to say, okay, I have enough Bitcoin that I can do a startup, take that risk, and if I fail, I still have this store of value to back me up in the future. Do you think it will have that effect?
It certainly will have that effect. So I did a show with Michael Flaxman, who's one of my friends, who's done a lot of startups, and we talked specifically about startups and the startup world right now. And the dirty secret of startups right now is that it's almost always outside funded, right? There's VC money or angel funding or whatever. It's never the founders, well, it is sometimes, but it's almost never the founders themselves that put their own money on the line. And you act very differently in a startup when it's your own money on the line versus someone else's money on the line. For a lot of younger people, it's kind of like, well, okay, well, I'll work like 90 hours a week, but it's at least somebody else's money, so I'm not taking that much of a risk. That to me is why you hear about all these like weird startup companies that spend way too much money on massages and vodka shots and weird things like that. If it's your own money, you're not going to spend money on massages and vodka shots, right? Like it's a very different thing. So in that sense, when you have savings of your own, I think as entrepreneurs, you just become a lot more careful with your money. And that means there's less waste and more people sort of wanting to create things that actually provide value to the community instead of like, let's just get big at all costs and, VCs will bail us out or, going public will bail us out or something like that. And that's sadly the mentality we have today. So I would love to see that change. This conversation reminds me,
Jimmy, of as much money as Congress spends. You never hear about congressmen overspending their own office budgets. Do you know why?
Why?
Because we all get an allocation of money for our offices. And you can spend it on employees, on traveling to and from your district, on computers and other means of doing your job. If you overspend your budget, it comes out of your personal pocket. Your personal pocket. It does not come out of taxpayer money. That's why no one overspends their budget. Or if they do, they only do it once because it comes out of their personal pocket. And if there were a way to do that in a more expanded way than just the congressmen and the senators' individual budgets, it might make us more responsible.
So if you were to feel like you're just spending other people's money, but you had to like have some skin in the game, this would change things.
Exactly.
Wow. That would be amazing if like for every bill that you sponsored, you had to pay like 0.1% of it or something. Like, okay, this is $2 trillion program. You owe us $20 billion or $10 billion or something. I don't know. That would be amazing. I would love to see something like that. And in a sense, I think it would keep a lot of senators and congressmen like a little more honest. But then you might get the argument that only rich people are going to be running for these offices. But from what I understand, like most senators and congressmen are rich already.
Well, I think that there are certainly have above average incomes. But it's surprising. Well, you look at a wonderful guy, David Valadao, I would point to. He's a California congressman. He just got reelected. He is in the dairy farming business, which is a highly leveraged business. And he's highly leveraged. So if you look at a guy like David Valadao, I mean, he is an example of, a very hardworking American whose balance sheet looks scary. So no, they're not all rich, but I think the vast majority are doing pretty well.
Which brings me to sort of like that saying, which is a lot of people want money out of politics, right? Like they hate the lobbying, and I think I have a lot of sympathy for that, right? Because it's like you're basically doing pay for play or some form of bribery or something like that in some obscure way that's legal. But in a sense, with Bitcoin, what you get is you get to take the politics out of money, which for me is the way in which you control all of the money influencing politics. What do you think of this idea, and how do you think that changes your job?
Well, I love that notion. I don't know how it would work in implementation. I'll have to think more about it. It would be, obviously, money has a huge influence on politics. And so if we can find ways to limit its negative influence, one of the ways I see it really exercising influence is as a fence. There are certain businesses that want to fence out the competition.
Regulatory moats.
You got it.
Yeah.
I think that that's a place where money really does play a huge role in protecting existing businesses so they can get bigger and bigger and finding ways through regulation to swat off the competition. Golly, if you could find a way to make policies that would make that more difficult to build those moats, those walls, whatever, I think that the American economy would flourish.
I would love to see a lot more smaller companies, because it does seem like the reason why a lot of those companies get that big is, at least I'm theorizing, is because they can lobby for certain regulatory modes. A mom and pop grocery store doesn't have the budget to lobby Congress or
exactly
anything like
right.
that. So in a sense, like we have a lot of this economy that's got these really large companies that control so much. Like, talk me through like how they use that as an advantage to, regulatory moats are one, to, influence Congress to give them certain advantages and so on.
Let's say a large business. Let's just pick a large technology business and call it large tech. Contributes to campaigns on both sides of the aisle, by the way, because you need friends on both sides of the aisle. And then they bring in a plan to allow their business to grow to the disadvantage of another. And that, because their lobbyist is a really nice person who you really enjoy being with, you might listen to them longer or more often than someone who has the countervailing point of view. And maybe these smaller competitors don't even know that this big tech company is in lobbying for something that is tremendously counter to your interests until it's too late. And I think that that sort of stealth access, that one-sided access, is a way that large business protects its largeness.
That's kind of a very sad thing.
It is. Well, it is sad, but I see it with big pharma. That's another area where
Big agro. Yeah.
big ag, big everything, big business, big labor is in the same boat. Big labor protects itself from small labor. Big business protects itself from small business. So it's it's a constant challenge.
Yeah, which reminds me, I do want to ask you one thing about politics specifically. It does feel like there's kind of been a shift in the last 10 years or so, where, I don't know, Republicans were more known as like party of big business, and Democrats were more known as like, I don't know, People's Party or something like that. But that seems to have shifted because like a lot more bigger companies seem to be supporting Democrats, and Republicans seem to be more about the little guy. What the heck happened?
I would love to read a book about that because I agree with you. When I was a kid, the Democrat Party was the party of the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. Individual rights were really paramount. Now, it's the Republican Party that is defending the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And the Democrats are not. And that is a complete change. I see transparency versus privacy as having flipped. I think now the Republicans are the party of government transparency and personal privacy. And Democrats are just the opposite. To me, that's a flip from the way I thought about it when I was a kid. So, and I also think we used to call them just a few years ago, we referred to them as Walmart Republicans. They were blue-collar Republicans. At one point, they were called Reagan Republicans or Reagan Democrats because they tended to be either smaller business or blue-collar, which had at one time been the base of the Democrat Party. Now they're the base of the Republican Party. And you're right, it seems like big business, Wall Street, big tech in particular, are very much the base of the Democrats. How that happened, how it flipped, should be material for a fascinating read.
Yeah, well, I mean, not just a read. We've sort of lived through it. It's hard to explain what the heck happened. Like, there's almost like a realignment of sorts that seems to have happened that I really still don't fully get.
Yeah, I don't get it either. Jimmy, I was married. My husband is no longer alive, but he and I were married for 31 years. He was a Democrat when I married him. He was a Democrat for the first 25 years of our marriage. And he was part of those, the blue-collar, small business, working American that identified with the Democrat Party that eventually switched and became a Republican. And when he died, he was an ardent Republican. He hadn't changed. The parties had changed. And I don't know why.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating question. If any of you listeners are interested in writing about this, I think this would make a fascinating book.
It would.
All right. So I think we're getting to the close of this time. So this is a question that I like to ask my guests. First is, 20 years from now, where do you see Bitcoin and how do you think it changes politics?
20 years from now, I see Bitcoin as a part of every diversified asset allocation. I see it as a part of retirement funds. I see it as a part of mutual funds, of exchange-traded funds. I see it as an adjunct to every country's economy, even the bigs, even the U.S., China, Japan. And I hope that it will be a major part of the individual working person's investments. Because the fundamentals of Bitcoin are so tried and true. They are so simple. They're so historically correct that I just see Bitcoin becoming embedded in the next 20 years in the world lexicon, certainly the American lexicon, and I see it being respected right alongside what are currently mainstream currencies. Furthermore, if the U.S. dollar is no longer the world reserve currency, I can see, and let's say it's a basket of currencies that becomes the world reserve currency, I can see Bitcoin being a big player in that basket because it is internationally ubiquitous and capable of being owned by people all over the world, and its value being preserved by people all over the world. So I think it becomes not only fashionable to be stable, but fashionable to have it sit alongside the strongest world currencies in a basket of currencies that is deemed stable and maybe even is the stabilizer in that basket. So I'm pretty high on it, as you can see.
How would that affect politics, though? Like, do you think you'll have maybe more budget constraints or something like that? Because in a sense, that's a large part of the problem right now.
Yeah. And I wish I knew. That is, I haven't thought it through, or it's still murky to me. Jimmy, I'm relying on people like you and your listeners to inform me about where you see that going and how we get there.
Well, thank you so much for coming on this show. Where can people find you? How can people follow you online?
Well, right now we're still at lummisforwyoming.com, which is a campaign website, but in January, it will change to a more official website. So it'll be something like Cynthia Lummis at senate.gov or something like that. So stay tuned. We're in transition from the unofficial to the official. But that doesn't mean I don't want to engage with this thought group, because I see you and your listeners as thought leaders in helping form the intellectual and cultural basis for how we integrate Bitcoin into the future.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure, Jimmy. Thank you very much.
Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Bitcoin Fixes This. Cynthia can be found at Cynthia M. Lummis on Twitter and on lummisforwyoming.com. Until next time, fiat delenda est.